The morning of May 15, 1943, began like any other in Darwin. Hot, humid, the kind of oppressive heat that made your uniform stick to your skin before you'd even had your morning coffee. But within hours, the skies above Australia's northern frontier would become a hellscape of fire, metal, and blood. What started as a routine scramble against Japanese bombers would explode into the largest aerial battle ever fought over Australian soil. A battle where victory and annihilation danced so close together that no one could tell them apart. Before we dive into this incredible story of courage, sacrifice, and impossible odds, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and if you've ever heard about Darwin's forgotten air war. Now, I need you to understand something crucial before we go any further. What happened in the skies over Darwin that day wasn't just another dogfight. It was the moment when a handful of exhausted, outnumbered Australian and Allied pilots stood between their homeland and complete devastation. It was the moment when young men, some barely out of their teens, faced an enemy force so overwhelming that survival seemed like a mathematical impossibility. And it was the moment that would be deliberately obscured, minimized, and nearly erased from history for reasons that will shock you. This is not just a war story. This is a story about how ordinary people become extraordinary when everything they love hangs in the balance. This is about the pilots who looked death in the face and said, "Not today. Not here. Not on our watch." Let me take you back to early 1943. Darwin wasn't the bustling city you might imagine today. It was a frontier town, Australia's northern outpost, a place where the war felt close enough to touch. Just 15 months earlier, on February 19, 1942, Darwin had experienced its own Pearl Harbor. Japanese carrier-based aircraft, the same forces that had devastated the American Pacific Fleet, turned their attention to Australia's doorstep. They came in waves, 242 aircraft in total, and they left Darwin in ruins. Ships burning in the harbor, buildings reduced to rubble, nearly 250 dead. It was the largest single attack ever mounted by a foreign power on Australian soil, and it shattered the illusion that the war was something happening far away to other people. But that was just the beginning. Over the following 16 months, Darwin would be bombed 64 times. 64 times. Let that sink in. While the rest of Australia went about their lives, while Sydney and Melbourne enjoyed relative peace, Darwin lived under a sword of Damocles that could fall any day, any hour. The people who remained, the soldiers, the pilots, the support crews, they lived with a kind of trauma that most Australians would never understand. Every siren, every distant engine sound, every morning that began with clear skies could be the last morning for someone. And by May 1943, the defenders of Darwin were exhausted. Among these defenders was a group of pilots that Hollywood couldn't have invented if they tried. There was squadron leader Robert "Bobby" Gibbies, already a legend with multiple kills to his name. A man whose calm demeanor masked a tactical genius that made him one of the most effective fighter leaders in the Pacific. There were Americans from the 54th Fighter Squadron, men who had volunteered or been assigned to defend a country that wasn't even their own, flying P-40 Kitty Hawks that were outmatched by the nimble Japanese Zeros in almost every category except diving speed and firepower. There were Australians from 452 Squadron, flying Spitfires that had finally arrived after months of pleading for modern aircraft. These men were tired. They'd been flying almost daily patrols, scrambling at a moment's notice, losing friends and wingmen to an enemy that seemed endless. They'd seen their bullets hit home, watched Zeros spiral into the Timor Sea, only to see more appear the next day. It was a war of attrition, and they were on the wrong end of the math. But they kept flying. They kept fighting. Because what else could they do? Behind them was everything they were sworn to protect. Ahead of them was an enemy that had shown no mercy, no hesitation, no sign of stopping. Now, let me introduce you to the antagonists of this story, and understand something important here. These weren't monsters. They were men, just like the Australians. But they represented a military doctrine that valued attack above all else, that saw Australia as a strategic target that needed to be neutralized or subjugated. The Japanese naval air forces attacking Darwin were among the most experienced combat pilots in the world. They'd fought in China, they'd devastated Pearl Harbor, they'd swept through Southeast Asia with terrifying efficiency. Their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0, was at the start of the war arguably the finest carrier-based fighter on the planet. It could outturn anything in the sky, had exceptional range, and in the hands of a skilled pilot was absolutely deadly. These pilots approached war with a samurai mentality that Western forces struggled to understand. Surrender was not an option. Retreat was shameful. Every mission was flown with an intensity that bordered on suicidal, because to die in service of the emperor was the highest honor. They looked at the Australian defenders not with hatred, but with a kind of professional disdain. These were inferior forces, flying inferior aircraft, defending an isolated outpost that would inevitably fall. It was only a matter of time. Their arrogance wasn't unfounded, it was built on victory after victory, on seeing enemy forces crumble before them again and again. But there was something these experienced Japanese pilots didn't fully understand about the men defending Darwin. They didn't understand the Australian character, forged in a harsh land that didn't forgive mistakes. They didn't understand the mateship, the bond between pilots who had trained together, drunk together, mourned together. They didn't understand that these men weren't fighting for abstract concepts of empire or glory. They were fighting for the bloke next to them, for the ground crews who worked through the night to keep their planes flying, for the people of Darwin who refused to evacuate despite the bombings, for their families down south who tried to sleep at night wondering if their sons and husbands were still alive. The Japanese pilots saw numbers and tactics. The Australians saw something worth dying for. And that would make all the difference. The morning of May 15th started with intelligence reports that were both routine and ominous. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted, which meant a raid was likely coming. The question was never if, but when and how many. At approximately 9:30 a.m., radar stations picked up a formation approaching from the north. This was it. The scramble order came through, and across multiple airfields around Darwin, pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Engines roared to life, the familiar cough and rumble of Allison and Merlin engines breaking the morning tension. Ground crews yanked wheel chocks, gave thumbs up, and watched as their pilots taxied and took off into a sky that was about to become hell. Bobby Gibbies led the Spitfire squadron up, climbing hard to gain altitude advantage. The P-40 pilots followed, knowing their aircraft were better suited for diving attacks than turning dogfights. They'd learned through bitter experience how to fight Zeros. Use your speed, use your firepower, never try to turn with them, hit them hard and break away. Stick to your wingman, watch each other's six, come home alive. As they climbed through 15,000 feet, they saw them. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft, bombers escorted by Zero fighters, coming in with the kind of precision that spoke to years of combat experience. The radio crackled with terse commands, target calls, warnings. And then they were in it. The first pass was chaos, the kind of violent confusion that no amount of training can really prepare you for. Tracers cutting through the air, the hammering sound of machine guns and cannon fire, aircraft pulling G-forces that grayed out vision, the smell of cordite and hot metal and fear sweat. A Zero flashed past Gibbs' canopy so close he could see the pilot's face. He rolled, dove, came up behind another Zero, and fired a 2-second burst that walked rounds right into the engine cowling. Smoke, flames, the Zero falling away in a death spiral. No time to watch. Another enemy on his tail. Brake left, dive, pull up, scissors maneuver, shake him off. His wingman called out a bomber, and they dove together, slashing through the formation with guns blazing. One bomber trailing smoke, another losing pieces of its wing, the formation starting to break apart. The Australians were fighting with a fury born of months of frustration, every trigger pull an answer to every friend lost, every sleepless night, every bombing raid they couldn't stop. The P-40 pilots were proving that while their aircraft might be outclassed on paper, in the hands of determined men who knew their strengths, they were deadly. They dove from altitude, building speed the Zeros couldn't match, fired devastating bursts from their 650 caliber machine guns, and blew through the formations before the enemy could react. The sky became a three-dimensional battlefield of screaming dives, desperate climbs, aircraft tumbling out of control, trailing fire and smoke. Parachutes blossomed, both Allied and Japanese. Men who seconds before had been trying to kill each other, now facing the same desperate hope that they'd survive the fall. The radio was constant chaos, warnings, confirmations, desperate calls for help. Zero on your six. Got him, he's burning. Break right, break right. Where are you, where are you? I'm hit, going down. In the first 20 minutes of combat, the Australians and Americans achieved something remarkable. Through skill, courage, and sheer determination, they shot down 22 Japanese aircraft. 22. Zeros falling from the sky like burning leaves. Bombers breaking apart under concentrated fire. It should have been a moment of triumph, a victory against overwhelming odds. The pilots, ammunition running low, some with battle damage, began to think they'd done it. They'd broken the attack. They'd protected Darwin once again. They could see the remaining Japanese aircraft turning away, heading back north. Victory. Survival. Another day alive. And then the radar operators' voices came through the radio, and every pilot's blood turned to ice. Another formation. Bigger. Much bigger. Over 100 aircraft inbound. The silence on the radio in that moment was deafening. You have to understand what was going through these men's minds. They were exhausted. Burning. Through adrenaline that was starting to turn into the shakes. Their ammunition was depleted. Some down to their last few seconds of firing time. They had battle damage, holes in wings, hydraulic leaks, engines running rough from pushing them past their limits. Some were already thinking about landing, about the beer they'd have, about writing letters home, about collapsing into their bunks. And now they were being told that the main attack, the real attack, was just arriving. That everything they'd just been through was only the opening act. The sense of despair, of overwhelming odds, must have been crushing. This is the moment that defines heroes. Not when victory is certain, not when the odds are in your favor, but when every rational part of your brain is screaming at you to run, to preserve yourself, to acknowledge that you've done enough, given enough, sacrificed enough. And yet these men, these exhausted, depleted, traumatized men, made the decision to turn back toward the enemy. Bobby Gibby's voice came over the radio, calm despite everything. Right, mates, here we go again. Same as before. Protect the town. Watch each other. Let's show them what we're made of. There was no dramatic speech, no rallying cry. Just simple words from a man who understood that sometimes courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. The pilots checked their ammunition counters, looked at their fuel gauges, and turned north, toward a formation of enemy aircraft that outnumbered them by more than 10 to 1. The ground crews in Darwin watched the sky with binoculars and they knew that the men up there were facing annihilation. Civilians who had stayed despite the bombings, who had been through raid after raid, stood in doorways and looked up, knowing that between them and destruction was a thin line of exhausted pilots in battered aircraft. The tension on the ground was palpable. A collective holding of breath. A prayer that couldn't be spoken because to voice it would acknowledge the terror that everyone felt. The second wave came in with overwhelming force. This wasn't a bombing raid. This was an attempt to destroy Darwin's air defenses permanently. To clear the skies so that future raids could proceed unopposed. The Japanese had clearly decided that the persistent defense was becoming a problem that needed a permanent solution. The Zeros came in hunting, specifically targeting the defending fighters. The bombers flew higher, protected by layers of escorts. It was a masterpiece of coordination and overwhelming force, and against it stood a handful of Allied pilots who by all rights should have disengaged, should have landed to rearm and refuel, should have preserved themselves for another day. But they didn't. What followed was not a battle. It was a sustained act of defiance against impossible odds. The pilots who still had ammunition used every round with precision they'd never achieved before. Single shots and short bursts, making every bullet count. Those who were out of ammunition made feinting attacks, drawing enemy fire, disrupting formations, using their aircraft as a psychological weapon. They flew through enemy formations at full throttle, forcing Zeros to break off their attacks on other Allied aircraft. They acted as decoys, as distractions, as anything that could help their mates, even knowing that every minute they stayed in the fight increased their chances of never making it home. One P-40 pilot, completely out of ammunition, actually tried to ram a Zero that was on his wingman's tail. He missed by inches, the Japanese pilot breaking away in shock at the suicidal attack. Another Spitfire pilot, his guns jammed, used his aircraft's superior speed in a dive to lead a group of Zeros away from the bomber's approach path, drawing them into a wild chase across the sky that kept them out of the fight for crucial minutes. The examples of raw courage were everywhere. Young men doing things that they would never be able to fully explain later, operating on instinct and training and something deeper, something primal that emerges when you're fighting for something larger than yourself. And here's what the Japanese pilots didn't anticipate. They expected the defenders to break, to run, to preserve themselves in the face of overwhelming numbers. That's what rational military doctrine would dictate. But the Australians and Americans didn't break. Every time the Japanese thought they'd cleared a sector, more Allied fighters would appear, damaged, trailing smoke, but still fighting. It was like fighting ghosts, like facing an enemy that refused to accept the mathematical reality of the situation. The battle raged for over an hour, one of the longest sustained aerial engagements in the Pacific theater. The sky was a nightmare of burning aircraft, tracers, cannon fire, screaming engines, and desperate maneuvers. Pilots on both sides pushed their aircraft and themselves beyond normal human and mechanical limits. G-forces that caused blackouts, maneuvers that should have torn wings off, moments where death was avoided by fractions of a second, and slowly, impossibly the tide began to turn. The Japanese formation, despite its overwhelming numbers, began to lose cohesion. The constant attacks, the refusal of the defenders to break, the mounting losses, it created confusion and doubt. Bomber pilots, unable to line up their runs properly under constant harassment, began to jettison their bombs early, missing their targets. Zero pilots, frustrated by an enemy that wouldn't stay still long enough to kill, began making mistakes, tactical errors born of anger and confusion. Several Zeros collided with each other in the chaos, so intent on pursuing individual targets that they forgot to watch their own spacing. The formation that had approached with such precision and confidence was being shredded not by superior numbers or better aircraft, but by the sheer bloody-minded refusal of a handful of defenders to give up. And then, something remarkable happened. The Japanese commander, watching his formation disintegrate, watching the unexpected resistance, made a decision. He ordered a withdrawal. The remaining bombers turned away, the Zeros regrouped to cover them, and the massive formation began to head back north. The Allied pilots, running on fumes both literally and figuratively, didn't pursue. They couldn't. They had nothing left to give. They turned back toward Darwin, aircraft barely flying, engines sputtering, some on their last gallons of fuel. As they approached the airfield, ground crews ran out to guide them in, counting aircraft, looking for missing friends. Not everyone came back. Some pilots had gone down in the ocean, some overland, some simply never returned and would never be found. The butcher's bill was high, but Darwin still stood. The airfields were operational. The city had been saved, not by superior technology or overwhelming force, but by the courage of men who refused to accept defeat. As the pilots climbed out of their aircraft, many collapsed right there on the wing or the ground, legs shaking too hard to support them, hands trembling with adrenaline dump, some vomiting from the stress and physical exertion, others just sitting in stunned silence, unable to process what they'd just survived. Bobby Gibbies walked among them, checking on each pilot, a quiet word here, a hand on a shoulder there. His own hands were shaking, though he tried to hide it. He'd shot down 3 more Zeros in the second wave. But he'd also watched friends go down, watched parachutes that never opened, seen things that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The ground crews brought water, cigarettes, anything to help these men come back to themselves. And in that moment, there was no celebration, no triumphant cheering. There was only a profound, exhausted relief. They'd done the impossible. They'd faced annihilation and survived. But the cost was written on every face, in every 1,000-yard stare, in every hand that couldn't stop shaking. This was victory, but it was victory that tasted like ashes and blood. Now here's where this story takes a turn that most people don't know about. You'd think that this battle, the largest aerial combat over Australian soil, would be front-page news, would be taught in every history class, would be remembered as one of the defining moments of Australia's war effort. But it wasn't. For decades, the full truth of what happened over Darwin on May 15, 1943, was obscured, minimized, buried in classified reports and official histories that gave it barely a footnote. Why? Because of politics, because of egos, because telling the full story would have required admitting some uncomfortable truths. It would have required admitting that Darwin was far more vulnerable than the government wanted the public to know. It would have required acknowledging that the Japanese air threat was far more serious and sustained than official propaganda suggested. It would have required giving credit to American pilots fighting under Australian command in ways that complicated neat nationalistic narratives. The official records listed the day as a successful interception of enemy raiders, with minimal detail. The kill counts were disputed, minimized, tangled in bureaucracy. Many pilots never received the recognition they deserved. Some medals were awarded decades later, after the men who earned them were long dead. The families of those who didn't come back were told their loved ones died defending Australia, but not told how desperate that defense had been, how close Darwin came to being completely overwhelmed. This deliberate historical amnesia wasn't unique to Australia. It happened in many nations during and after the war. But it meant that one of the most remarkable examples of courage and sacrifice in Australian military history was nearly forgotten. But here's the beautiful redemptive truth that emerged decades later, as historians began to dig through Japanese records, interview surviving pilots from both sides, piece together the full story from scattered reports and personal diaries. The Japanese High Command was shocked by what happened over Darwin on May 15th. Their after-action reports described the defense as fanatical, beyond expectation, unlike any resistance encountered in previous operations. They had expected to destroy Darwin's air defenses and clear the way for a potential invasion or at minimum unrestricted bombing. Instead, they lost dozens of aircraft and experienced something they'd rarely encountered, a defensive force that fought beyond any rational calculus. The Japanese never mounted another large-scale raid on Darwin after May 15, 1943. Read that again. Never. They continued smaller raids, but the massive formations designed to overwhelm the defenders never came back. Not because they couldn't, but because the cost-benefit analysis had changed. The defenders had shown that attacking Darwin would always be expensive, always be bloody, always be uncertain. The handful of pilots who fought that day hadn't just won a battle, they'd won the entire campaign through sheer demonstration that some places, some people, cannot be easily conquered. When this began to come out in the 1980s and 1990s, as researchers published books and articles, piecing together the truth, there was a movement to finally recognize what these men had done. Survivors like Bobby Gibbies, now elderly men, were interviewed and finally told their stories publicly. The Australian War Memorial began a project to properly document the Darwin Air War. Families of the fallen learned for the first time the full context of their loved ones' sacrifice. And something beautiful happened. The redemption wasn't just historical, it was personal. Veterans who had lived for decades with the trauma of what they'd experienced, who had been told their stories weren't important enough for the official histories, who had struggled with survivor's guilt and PTSD before that term even existed. These men finally received recognition. They were invited to ceremonies, schools, documentaries. Their stories were told to new generations. The Australian public learned about the forgotten battle, and there was a collective sense of shame that it had taken so long, and pride in what these men had achieved. Bobby Gibbies lived until 2007, long enough to see his wartime service properly honored, long enough to speak to young pilots and tell them what leadership really means. He never presented himself as a hero. Until the end, he insisted he was just doing his job, that the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. But in his later years, when pressed, he would say something profound. We weren't fighting for glory or medals or history books. We were fighting for the bloke next to us, for the people on the ground counting on us. And when you're fighting for something that matters, when you're standing between harm and the people you care about, you find strength you didn't know you had. That's not heroism. That's just being human at your best. The other veterans echoed this sentiment in their own ways. They spoke about how the experience changed them, how facing death and choosing to fight anyway revealed something fundamental about human nature. They spoke about mateship, about the bonds forged in combat that outsiders could never fully understand. They spoke about the burden of surviving when others didn't, and how recognition and remembrance helped ease that burden, not for themselves, but for the memory of the ones who fell. The families of the fallen experienced their own redemption. To finally know the full story, to understand that their fathers, brothers, husbands, hadn't just died in some minor skirmish, but had been part of something truly historic, something that changed the course of the war in Australia's north, brought a sense of meaning to losses that had seemed random and cruel. Gold Star mothers who had lived for 50 years not knowing the full circumstances of their sons' deaths finally got answers. Widows who had remarried and built new lives but never forgotten their first loves learned that those men had been part of something extraordinary. And here's what makes this story so powerful in its final message. Aussie. Arrogance of the Japanese military leadership, their assumption that overwhelming force and superior experience would inevitably triumph, was shattered by something they hadn't accounted for, the human factor. The willingness of ordinary people to become extraordinary when protecting what they love. The power of courage and determination to change mathematical equations that should be unchangeable. But this story's lesson extends far beyond just the military context. Think about what those pilots did in the broader sense. They faced a situation where every rational voice told them to give up, to preserve themselves, to accept that they'd done enough. The odds were impossible. The outcome seemed predetermined, and they fought anyway. How many times in our own lives do we face moments where the odds seem overwhelming, where giving up would be the rational choice, where we've already done enough and could walk away with our dignity intact? The pilots over Darwin teach us that sometimes the most important moments in life are when we choose to keep fighting despite the odds, not because victory is certain, but because the fight itself matters. They teach us about resilience, about finding strength in community and shared purpose, about how the bonds between people can enable them to achieve things that individuals never could. They teach us that heroes aren't people without fear. They're people who feel the fear and act anyway because something greater than themselves demands it. This story also reveals a profound truth about how we remember history and honor sacrifice. For decades, these men's stories were minimized or forgotten, not because what they did wasn't important, but because it was inconvenient for official narratives. How many other stories of courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary achievement are buried in archives, waiting for someone to bring them to light? How many people died without ever knowing how much their actions mattered? The redemption,